Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets. Hi everyone, my name is Richard Diaz and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap. In this week's episode, we're going to shy away from the tariff noise. In our view, the dust has not even begun to settle on the issue. And of course, the ongoing federal election further complicates things for Canada. Instead, we are again going to touch on one of my favorite Canadian macroeconomic themes, natural resource infrastructure, specifically oil and gas pipelines, and why it is so important to the Canadian economy and its sovereignty. But this week, we're going to attack the subject from a completely different angle. We're going to make the case that just like 150 years ago, when Canada built a railway to stop the American expansion north, expanding Canada's infrastructure is critical to protecting Canadian sovereignty in the 21st century. The idea came to me as I started reading the book Dominion, The Railway and the Rise of Canada by Stephen R. Brown, which is a thrilling account of the engineering triumph that created this great country. In the mid-1800s, in the face of economic uncertainty and political threats, an idea emerged in political and business circles in Ottawa and Montreal to connect the disparate British colonies into a single entity that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But I should have known better. A professor out of Toronto, Lloyd Alter, beat me to the punch and wrote an excellent article about how Canada should dream and think big again in order to stave off any expansionist ideas from our neighbor. In the article, which I recommend, I'll put the Substack link in the comments below, Professor Alter argues that the Canadian government should invest in high-speed rail, electric transit, and walkable communities to insulate itself from America. What I learned from the book and the article is that we have seen this before. The U.S. imposing tariffs on Canadian goods is reminiscent of past trade disputes like the 1866 repeal of the Reciprocity Treaty, a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Canada. The article is where I found this amazing cartoon of John A. Macdonald smiling over his ward, protecting them from the greedy American manufacturers. So what does that have to do with trains? Well, after Confederation in 1867, Canada was still a very fragile union. The Western territories were sparsely populated and vulnerable to American annexation, especially since U.S. leaders often spoke about expanding northward. So when British Columbia agreed to join Canada in 1871, it was under the condition that a transcontinental railway would be built to connect it to the rest of the country, and in a very real way protect it. And this makes total sense, of course. Without the Canadian Pacific Railway, Western territories were at the mercy of the American railway network to get goods from west to east so that they might be sold in Europe. Stop me if you've heard this before. This is again where I'll recommend Stephen R. Brown's book, because this was an incredible feat of engineering that should not be overlooked. Fast forward 150 years, and we are again reminded of the old saying, history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And again, it's goods from Western territories that are at the mercy of American infrastructure. But this time, it's not goods via railway, but oil and gas via pipeline. And despite any protestations to the contrary, it is the East that is extremely vulnerable. Ontario, Quebec, and maritime provinces get virtually all of their oil and gas via pipeline from the U.S. This means that should it come down to it, the U.S. could cut off the East completely from its vital energy needs. From a security standpoint, this should be completely unacceptable, as it was in 1871. This is where, in my view, the professor missed the trick. He focused too much on green policies and reimagining cities, and that's fair enough. Such is his focus. By contrast, my view is that by building a network of pipelines from west to east, it would address one of Canada's biggest security failings and exploit an obvious opportunity. And like the railway before, boost our economy and help ensure our sovereignty for the next 200 years. So at this point, I am forced to remind the viewer that Canada is still a petro state. Please check out my video on the subject, But in short, Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. We're the fourth largest producer of oil, although we tend to jockey for position with China, Iraq, and Iran. This output ensures a massive surplus, which is a huge source of wealth for Canada. And most importantly, it's about Canada's current account balance. Current account is about money flowing in versus money flowing out. It includes trade in goods and services and financial flows. Any massive negative deficit must be financed by foreign monies, and if it's too large or unsustainable, it will get corrected. You will note that Canada's current account is roughly in balance. Without oil, we would face a painful internal adjustment, less consumption, or an external adjustment through a lower exchange rate, higher inflation, and less consumption. For many years now, Canadian leaders and the media have tripped over themselves to attack and deride Canada's oil and gas industry, going so far as to announce that Canada is essentially a post-oil economy. Add that to the $25 billion worth of pipeline projects going from west to east that have been gleefully blocked. And I remind you that 97% of our oil goes down south. This is largely because there is no west to east pipeline. With Trump tariffs and more saber rattling, I was under the impression that there had been some kind of sentiment shift. The hope is that the southern threat would crystallize the need to dream big and build those east-west connections. Unfortunately, as recently as a couple of days ago, Mark Carney admitted that he would not repeal Bill C-69. This is a key bill that has stood in the way of many pipeline projects throughout Canada. Add that to the ongoing reticence of the Quebec sovereigntists to allow the pipeline across the Quebec province, and it's not clear at all that Canada can build something as important and vital to the economy and our sovereignty like the Canadian Pacific Railway. Without that important infrastructure to bind parts of Canada that are so far away and yet deeply connected from cultural and economic ties, we remain at the risk of the United States. And we leave on the table an incredible source of wealth that Canadians can take advantage of for the next 200 years. All right, so that's a wrap on this week's episode. Thanks again for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. And as always, we manage money for families all across Canada and North America and the world. So please feel free to get in touch.